Hello, past data community. I'm Bob Ward from Microsoft. You know, people ask me, Bob, what is your job at Microsoft? Well, it's kind of work on anything with the word SQL in it, including SQL Server and Azure SQL. Before we start, I want to take the time to thank all of you from the data community, Redgate, all the sponsors and organizers for keeping the past summit alive. Did you know I started presenting this event in 2003? I'm excited to be back again this year. And I'm just as excited to share my knowledge with you today as I did back then. I think there's something called SQL Server 2022 that may have hit the news last week. And we're going to continue at the summit today to talk a lot more about it. I also want to take the time right now to especially thank all the amazing people at Microsoft that have worked so hard over the entire last years that have helped make this a reality. You know, there's so many talented people at Microsoft that have poured all their efforts into making today happen for you, the data community. I get the honor of showing the technology, but the real people that deserve the credit are the people behind the scenes that you're not even getting a chance to see today and hear. But I tell you what, guess what? Today in this session, as I present, I have an army of rock stars from the SQL engineering team online with you to chat with you live as I present about SQL Server 2022 to answer your questions. We might have some time at the end to do some actual live Q&A chat with some of those engineering folks. But primarily, if you have questions about what we're going to talk about today, do all of that there in the Q&A window that you see today. So with that, let's get started. Let me use technology that I have over here to share my screen. And let's get rocking and rolling. So here we go. Okay, let's start talking SQL Server 2022. You're going to have some interesting detailed questions today. You may have seen the keynote this morning, and some of the stuff we talked about may have piqued your interest. Today is going to be a fairly comprehensive overview of SQL Server 2022 with all the capabilities that we're announcing for our private preview. But you want to go deeper. I get it. I usually present things that are very, very deep today in these sessions. I'm not doing that today in this session, some of it a little bit, but look at the lineup we have for the rest of the past summit here. Today, this afternoon, Pedro Lopes is going to dive deep into those intelligent database futures. You saw an example of that in the keynote. We'll talk more about it today. Tomorrow, I will have a deeper session to talk about all these cloud-connected technologies that you've heard about a little bit in the keynote, and you're going to hear more about today. And then finally, David Pless on Friday has a really nice deep dive of all those core storage engine capabilities that you know and love. So take a look at those capabilities to see, take a look at these sessions to see if it's something that you are interested in. Just double check something on the chat here to make sure. Okay, so let's get started. Let's talk about SQL Server 2022. But wait a minute, Bob, I want the deck. I want your decks. You've always been able to share your decks with us. How do I get this one? You see the link right here? aka.ms, bobwardms. This presentation that you see right now is already up on that website, all public information. Anything we're discussing today is public knowledge. Now, with that said, let's talk a little bit about where we've been. And the reason I do this is because I've learned when I presented on SQL 16, 17, and 19, these previous years, that I talk about functionality like query store or adaptive query processing or machine learning services or intelligent query processing. I talk about these things and customers are like, I don't even know what that is because I'm on older versions. So I want to make sure you know to take a look of some of the places where we've been so you can know where we're going. And where are we going? If you look at SQL Server 2022 at the highest level, what we call hero capabilities, you're going to see the following. You're going to see the fact that, and we demoed it today, the fact that we can use managed instance for business continuity for disaster recovery. You're also going to see that we can use things like Synapse Link to link SQL Server for near real-time analytics. You're also going to find out that we can use a technology called Azure Purview to get access and information about our data and to control policies for authentication and authorization on SQL Server. In addition, you've known, and we've talked about the fact that we're the least vulnerable database in the industry. We continue to prove that over even the last decade. But we want to go further in the security space, so we have a feature called SQL Server Ledger. We'll talk some about that today as well. And then finally, if you think about performance, we have generally industry been the price performance and performance leader with our transaction benchmarks. And we've proven that in past releases of what those look like. But we want to go further for you. We want to provide you things like built-in query intelligence, and in the availability space, light up scenarios like multi-replication with automatic conflict detection. Now, if you think about what we're doing for SQL Server and you look across the SQL edge to cloud, we're just continuing the tradition of providing you a consistent data platform, because guess what? This engine that we're releasing and talking about today is the same core engine that's powered from the edge, Arc Technologies, and in Azure SQL. Now, you may be watching today going, Bob, that's all very interesting, but I need some more. Like, what is really all in SQL Server 2022? Well, let's talk about that. But first, you probably want to know a little bit more about when and how. Like, okay, I got to get my hands on this. Well, guess what? We've announced SQL Server 2022 as a private preview to start with. So in order to get access, you need to sign up for us to work with us. And here is the link to that sign up. I'll have a resources page at the very end of today's session where I'll talk again about that way to sign up. Now, to be clear about this sign up though, we really intend the limited private preview to be for customers who are willing to work with us directly in engineering to test these features, give us feedback, discuss your workloads and your challenges so we can understand how best to serve you as we're making it towards the release of the product. Kendall Van Dyke, a program manager in our team, has done a really good job of organizing this with a private Teams channel and a GitHub repository once you sign up for the private preview. You also probably want to know when it says SQL Server 2022 private preview. What about public preview? Hey, when is it actually going to be available? Well, all we can tell you today is we're going to meet the name. So in calendar year 2022 is when we will be launching a public preview, and eventually SQL Server 2022 will go to general availability. So with that said, let me give you more of an overview first of the categories, and I have it kind of in a circle fashion of the capabilities of SQL Server 2022, and then we'll spend time in each area. In some areas we'll go a little deeper. We actually have a couple of live demos today, yes, live demos, that we'll show you. And of course, remember the other sessions we have, we're gonna go a lot deeper and have more demos there. So it all starts with this cloud connectivity concept. We've actually done that in the past in some scenarios, but we're taking it a step further. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to connect you to things like managed instance, Synapse, and Purview to light up new possibilities for disaster recovery, analytics, and security. Now, in addition, we're going to continue the tradition of providing you built-in query intelligence, and we're going to start combining forces with things like Query Store with the query processor to light up new capabilities. This is all about trying to get you faster with no code changes and reduce the time you need to do expensive query tuning. So cloud connection, built-in query intelligence. In addition, you've probably heard myself and Connor Cunningham refer to the core engine as the meat and potatoes of SQL Server. And that includes things like performance, scalability, and security. And we continue that tradition with this release. We'll talk some today of what that looks like. And don't forget that David Pless will be diving a lot more into that on Friday in his session. So those are three parts of the puzzle of what SQL Server 2022 comes with. What else is there? Well, we are going to continue what we worked on with Polybase to extend new data virtualization scenarios, but even also give you some interesting connections to things like object storage. So we'll talk some and even do a demonstration today of what that looks like. And then finally, the last part of our puzzle is T-SQL. We know a lot of you know the T-SQL language. You're familiar with that language. You have skills in that language. So we'd like to extend some new scenarios for developers in that space, leveraging, again, the great skills you have today. So in SQL 19, I had something that looked a little bit like this in quadrants, and people called it the camera slide. Feel free to take a photo of what this looks like. Hey, this is the beginning of this journey. We'll be presenting SQL Server 2022 in many different forms and fashions, even in the next few weeks at various events and online. And then, as you know how I roll, in next calendar year, get ready, because I will be talking a lot more about this release next year. So this is your camera slide to get an overview of the 5 areas in SQL Server 2022. Let's talk about some of them. First of all, let's talk about cloud connectivity. Now, I'd like to present some of these scenarios with a challenge that we've seen from customers and a solution we're providing. What is that challenge? Well, customers sometimes find it difficult to set up and maintain a disaster recovery site. It's not that you can't do it, you can do it, but how do you do it? How do you set it up? How easy is it to configure? How easy is it to maintain? What about people that set up a DR site for you and then leave the company and you're left trying to figure out how to make it work? Why not try to use the power of the cloud to make it more successful? So we announced last week a new thing called link feature in Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, for previous versions of SQL Server, that link feature involved migration scenarios. But for SQL Server 2022, it involves disaster recovery. And you probably saw a demonstration today in the keynote from Anna of what that actually looks like. Now, the concept being is this. You're going to be able to seamlessly set up a SQL Server 2022 instance to make Azure SQL Managed Instance a failover partner using distributed availability group technology. You don't have to set up and configure that. We do that for you. And you then, if you have issues on your SQL Server site, can then fail over to your Azure SQL Managed Instance as your disaster recovery site. Now, what we didn't show you and what our intention is by the time we release SQL Server 2022, is that you can actually fail back to SQL Server 2022, making a complete online failover system. What we did demonstrate for you today was the fact that you can also take a backup from Azure SQL Managed Instance and restore that to SQL Server 2022, marking the first time that we've really linked the ability to do that with SQL Server 2022 and Platform as a Service. So a lot of customers I've seen that we've already talked about this technology a little bit last week and some online are pretty excited to see how this could help them become more efficient to set up and maintain a DR site. Now, what about analytics? Today, you may be using your SQL Server to set up ETL jobs to copy data into a warehouse or an analytics system like Synapse. So the problem there being is what you've told us is it's hard to maintain ETL programs and jobs. Often the data's out of date for the needs that you have. And even it might affect operational workloads because you may actually be forced to do analytics on the operational workload. What if we could remove some of those barriers with a feature called Link for Synapse? Now imagine this concept now. Remove ETL jobs, go to SQL Server, configure and tell us the tables you'd like to link to Synapse, and then feed changes into Synapse SQL pools. Yeah, go to SQL Server, we'll go start reading log changes from the SQL Server system, our software that we have with SQL Server 2022. We'll take a look at those transaction log changes. We'll feed that into SQL pools for Synapse now for you. We'll first be able to synchronize the data and then just do what we call change feeds past this. Now, this is new technology. This isn't replication. This isn't change data capture. This is new technology we've integrated in the SQL Server 2022 engine to connect you to the cloud to get those change feeds. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you now have the ability to do these change feeds, now you don't have to run analytics on your operational SQL Server anymore. You can remove the need to do some of these copy jobs, and you get more near real-time analytics. So once you're in the Synapse space with this near real-time analytics data, you could then combine forces from SQL pools with things like Azure Data Lake Storage. You could be querying data across this, seeing your changes from SQL with information you're feeding into perhaps unstructured data in Azure Data Lake Storage. You could even do things like Spark jobs with Spark pools. You could be running Spark jobs to do things like machine learning or even use Azure machine learning to run machine learning models on that data, maybe even possibly train a model and push that to the edge if you need to. And then finally, you know the power of Power BI. So now your Power BI reports that are looking at this data in Synapse don't have to be maybe refreshed every day to see changes. Now you can see it more in near real time. So this is Link for SQL Server, Synapse Link for SQL Server. In my session tomorrow, I'll be talking a lot more details about what does managed instance disaster recovery actually look like under the covers, and what does Synapse Link look like under the covers. The third piece of the puzzle of cloud connectivity deals with security. And I mentioned Purview earlier in this discussion of our session. But note, there are two things that we didn't mention there, and that is Azure Active Directory authentication. So now with SQL Server 2022, if you want to be able to authenticate users without using SQL authentication, but take and use the power of Azure Active Directory, you can now do that. You've been able to do that with Azure SQL so far, right? You've seen scenarios where you can use AAD auth with Azure SQL Database and with Azure SQL Managed Instance. And the benefits of that are interesting because you can do things like multi-factor authentication now in those scenarios. We are now providing the ability now for SQL Server 2022 to use AAD auth as an alternative if you just are forced using SQL auth or you don't want to use even domain Kerberos authentication. What about Purview? You know, you've heard about that technology. We'll talk a little more details in a second of what that really means to you. But this is a new governance data state type technology in the cloud that we've announced. And we've had new announcements last week about some new capabilities. I'll show you more in a second of what's possible with Purview. Now, you may have heard of Defender. We actually called it Azure Defender up until last week. We've kind of rebranded that technology now under the whole Microsoft Defender brand. There's a Microsoft Defender for cloud, for Azure services. And there's also a Microsoft Defender for SQL. You may have already been using this technology, using things like SQL Server on Arc-enabled servers. You may be using it even with Azure SQL Virtual Machine. But did you know you can use it with SQL Server? And we will continue iterating and innovating this space to use it with SQL Server 2022. What's the benefit to me? Why would I even consider this? Well, how would you like to have a very proactive vulnerability assessment against your SQL servers to look for possible vulnerabilities from the configuration of your databases and your servers? And these aren't rules we just make up. These are based on industry standards like FedRAMP, CIS, and SOX compliance. And we keep those continually updated. So we'll frequently scan your system, provide you vulnerability assessments to see whether you need to take action. You also have the ability even to set baselines if you like to kind of ignore some of the rules that we're providing for you. In addition, there's something called advanced threat protection. How would you like to be able to go maybe for your SQL server and look if you've got some suspicious login or query activity against your SQL server? And the beautiful story about this technology is it works consistently across all your SQL assets. Now you could be looking at vulnerability assessments and threat protections across SQL Server, Azure SQL, anywhere we are, you can actually do that. Let's talk about Purview though a little bit. So what is the challenge? The challenge is that customers have told us, I've got a data estate, which means I've got things in the cloud, I've got things on premises, I've got all these different data sources I'm working with, and I need central visibility to that. I also need some governance across all of this. Now, if you have governance across all of this, how would you do this today? You would probably have to establish some policies. For example, I'd like to set up a policy that I have certain members of my organization that are in charge of performance monitoring. That's their job, right? But so far today, in order to do that across all these different data sources, I have to manually go to each one of them and establish this. I got to maintain it that way. And in some cases, I have to use like sysadmin type privileges, to do that. So what I'd rather be able to do is have more granular control of this. But really, I'd like to go to a central policy place as an organization, establish who are members of that new role for performance monitoring, and push these policies to the various data pieces like SQL Server. So think of this as setting up roles and access to your SQL Server without having to connect into SQL Server and do that yourself. So that's Azure Purview integration. And I'll be talking again also more about that in tomorrow's hybrid data platform session. You can also see sessions from my colleague Andres Volter this week at PASS, talking a lot more about this technology. Okay, so now that you've got a view of what cloud connected looks like, remember, it's disaster recovery or managed instance, it's near real-time analytics with Synapse, and it's security with Azure Active Directory, with Purview, and with Microsoft Defender. So the next, if you remember our circle we started with, right? We started with the cloud connectivity piece, making SQL the most hybrid data platform we've ever released yet. In the upper right-hand corner, I mentioned the word built-in query intelligence. Now today, a challenge for you that you've told us is query tuning is very expensive and time-consuming. I get that. And also, part of this query tuning exercise is to try to get faster. And in some cases, you end up changing the code, creating hints. We have to modify queries to get faster. And if you remember, in SQL Server 2017, we released technology called adaptive query processing. We even back in SQL 16 introduced a concept called Query Store, which a lot of you know and love. That's also been in the cloud. And then in SQL Server 2019, we kind of rebranded adaptive query processing to intelligent query processing. Now we're going to keep moving that needle forward. And we're going to actually, in some cases, combine the power of that with Query Store. But Query Store alone has some great pieces to it. And we believe now, for the first time in SQL Server 2022 on on-premises version of SQL, we should turn it on by default. And that's what we're going to do during this preview for new databases and gain your feedback to see how that works for you. There's some advantages in doing that for you when you turn this on. Why is that? An often asked customer request is the ability to do Query Store with read replicas. And we are now going to support that with SQL Server 2022. We'll also support that for replicas in the cloud. In addition, people have used plan guides for years to shape query plans for things going on with their queries where they really can't change the query. Well, we'd like to actually make that easier and simple for you with Query Store. We have a concept called Query Store Hints, where you can shape plans with no code changes required. We believe that's a simpler method for you to do than to have to use a plan guide. We also want to take some of the intelligent query processing functionality that we are delivering with this release, and in some cases, we would like to light that up and enable it and use Query Store as part of it. Now, not all of these scenarios require it, but some do. Let's take a look at 3 of the big ones and talk about them briefly. And then I have another slide after this where I'm going to go a little bit deeper on all the different features we're doing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this afternoon, not long after this session, my colleague Pedro Lopes is going to go a lot deeper for you in this space. Okay, so on by default, and you see here on the left, 2 of the functionalities that we're enabling in SQL Server 2022 are based on using the Query Store for various reasons. First of all, max degree of parallelism. Who doesn't have a challenge today with this concept? We know that. You have different ways of tuning max degree of parallelism at the server level, the database level, the query level, the resource governed level, right? But wouldn't it be nice if the query processor could use the Query Store to look at your queries and build a feedback mechanism to make this easier and adjust max DOP for certain queries so that you have a better workload experience? I am so excited to see this. I've been in support for a long time, as you know, before I joined the engineering team. I had all sorts of questions for so many years on max degree of parallelism. I'm hoping, and our plan for a lot of these features are to solve some of the common core issues in these spaces, and this is certainly one of those. Now, in SQL Server 2014, as you know, all her SQL Server users, we introduced a new cardinality estimation model that was called the CE model, and it was done for the right reasons, to make things more correct from a query plan point of view. Well, the problem is the behavior you experience in a lot of cases is it caused some issues for you, right? And we absolutely recognize that. And we've tried to actually show up and fix some of those problems for you. But still, I find a lot of customers today are going to move to a later version of SQL Server, say they move to SQL Server 2019, and they leave on the legacy cardinal estimation model. We get that, and we understand why you've done that. In SQL Server 2022, we would love to be able to free that burden from you, that maybe you could use the latest cardinal estimation model and then take advantage of something called CE feedback, using the power of the Query Store again to adapt and adjust workloads for you so that this just works by default. Now, don't forget, as you're looking at this screen right here, that this 2 functionality you see on the left are in the query processor itself, but both of them are going to combine forces with the Query Store to make them possible. Now, on the right, you may have saw a demonstration today in the keynote called parameter sensitive plan optimization. I don't know who created the term parameter sniffing. Everybody says I did. I probably will never fess up to you who actually created that term, but it's been a problem for a long time. And we recognize that's the case. And so it's my pleasure to tell you that today, not requiring the Query Store, but inside the query processor, we are going to try to solve problems for you. We're going to allow multiple plans in cache of the same parameterized statement or stored procedure. Pretty exciting stuff. And we're actually going to do a live demonstration. We're going to take the demo, by the way, that we did this, you saw in the keynote, and we're going to do it live, a live demo. We're going to slow down a little bit and explain some things of how it worked. I'm sure you got a lot of questions about this. You can ask some questions here in the session today. And again, don't forget that later today, Pedro will do a much more deeper dive. So let me just double check here. You know, what I've got over here is my command center. I'm looking at Zoom here. I'm looking at the chat window. Looks pretty good. I think things are going pretty well. Excited all of you here today to talk about SQL Server. Now, this is Bob's View of the World. Now, my wonderful colleague, Joe Sack, is with you today answering questions. And we have this kind of running debate. I call it next gen. He calls it third gen. It really is third gen. Remember, adaptive query processing, intelligent query processing, and now new intelligent query processing. But it really is the next generation and the third iteration of us building on what we did. And we always iterate in the cloud first, these technologies. It gives us great telemetry. Did you know, without looking at your data, we can kind of track to see whether these technologies are helping people with their workloads. And I've seen the data, they do. So if you're wondering, like, should I use this? we've seen customers in the cloud use these technologies, and it's greatly improved performance of their workloads. So what does this look like? If I'm going to think about upgrading to SQL Server 2022, what do I get? What do I have to turn on? How does it all work? Let's look at it this way. So number one, if, when this is generally available, you make an upgrade to this version of SQL Server, remember that if you use these DB compat levels, you are gaining what we've already done. So just by upgrading and staying on 140 or 150 compat levels, you are getting these technologies. Now, what about DB compats before then? Well, guess what? There are some things we're lighting up as well. So approximate percentile. We've done approximate versions in other ways in SQL Server. Again, this is a concept for big data type queries to use approximation for some of these functions versus what you need to do to actually scan the entire table. We have found this to be very successful for large analytic type queries. So you get that just by upgrading a SQL Server, despite whatever DB compat level you're using. In addition, if the query store is turned on, you get something called query compilation replay. Query compilation replay. That is allowing you to upgrade to SQL Server, and if the query store is turned on, we can actually record steps of compilation in a way in the query store so that when we have to recompile, it's much faster. We had this concept that customers ran into called compile storms, and this we believe is going to help solve some of those problems. Now, I already mentioned max.feedback. That is also you can use the query store to do a feedback loop to help process and make smoother those workloads to adjust max dot for certain queries. So again, on upgrade to SQL Server 2022, if you're using a DB compat less than 140, you get these three things here on the left. Two of them require the query store. If you're at DB compat 140, you get this, plus you get what we did in SQL 17. If you're on DB compat 150, you get this, plus what you had in SQL 19. Now, one of the things we did in SQL Server 17 and 19 is memory grant feedback. And so if you are on DB compat 140, as I mentioned here, and you upgrade to SQL Server 2022, you get some enhanced functionality about these two technologies. Number one, we found out from your feedback that the memory grant feedback mechanism had a lot of variations sometimes with what it did, a lot of oscillation. So we're using a new algorithm with percentiles to make that a smoother experience. That comes if you're running this DB compat level 140 or higher, that just comes and you just get that with the query processor. And if you have the query store enabled, we will be able to now persist memory grant feedback. So therefore, when you run your query, the memory grant feedback kicks in before, if the plan got evicted from cache, we'd have to start all over again. Now we can persist that now if a plan cache got evicted and just pick up where we left off. Then finally, we are introducing a new DB compat level. And with that DB compat level, there are two functionalities that light up. One is parameter sensitive plan optimization. Again, can we save the world from parameter sniffing? We hope so. We'll talk more about how that works in a second with our demonstration. What about cardinality estimation feedback, which I mentioned before? That comes with DB compat 160, but you have to have the query store turned on to take advantage of that functionality. Is this not one of the coolest lineups of features you've ever seen from our query processing team? The team has worked really, really hard to make this happen. Let's look at that parameter sensitive plan optimization story at a more visual way. But let's start with a story. I'm looking at my time check here. I think I've got a lot of time left. Good, that's great. I like to tell stories, as you know. You tell stories when you're older and been around for a while. This is a fun story. So in January of 2020, I was still going back and forth to the Microsoft office here in Las Colinas, Texas. I am here live from my home office here in Texas. And there's a gentleman named Jack Lee. None of you know who Jack Lee is. Maybe some of you who've been around and talked to me have heard of Jack Lee. I have worked with Jack Lee at Microsoft for I don't even know how long. Jack's probably been here as long as I've been. A superstar in CSS for performance troubleshooting. Well, you know, time went on and we just found out, the engineering team said, we got to hire this guy. So Jack had got hired a couple years ago by the engineering team to work on query processing. And in January 2020, I'm in Las Colinas at the office, and I walk up to Jack, who was at his desk that day. I said, Jack, hey, what you working on? What's new in the world of query processing that you're working on today? And Jack goes, well, Bob, you know, I don't really want to tell you yet because I just want to surprise you, but I think I can solve parameter sensitive plans or parameter sniffing. I'm like, what do you mean you can solve it? He goes, I think I can fix it. I'm like, oh my goodness. This is January 2020. I'm like, Jack, I have to have this. I have to demonstrate this. My intention was to be able to demonstrate it last year at the past keynote. We were still iterating on the technology. But I was so happy to be able to demonstrate and show that to you today during the keynote. How cool is it? Let's look at a visualization to make sure we're clear on what this does. So number one, let's assume that a user is running a stored procedure. Now, I love to pick on my colleagues. So I'm going to pick on a couple of them are on the call today. Let's say Joe Sack. You guys know Joe Sack, right? Joe Sack's running a stored procedure, and he has a procedure built by somebody else. And in that procedure, there's a parameter. That parameter is part of a select statement in the stored procedure based on a where clause. You've seen this, you've done it a million times. Turns out that that parameter in the where clause goes after a filter on a table, and there's indexes on this, right? And the statistics for those values are skewed. They're not consistent. The cardinality is not consistent, right? So for parameter value 1, Joe runs the procedure. We compile the plan based on that parameter, right? And it turns out an index seek is best for Joe. Joe's happy, things run fast, the world is great. Now Pedro Lopes comes along. He's the other user here. And oh, wait a minute, before Pedro comes along, you know what might can happen? A plan might get evicted from cache without Joe knowing about it, without anybody knowing about it, because some memory pressure, unforeseen situation. So Pedro comes along, Joe went off and had his coffee break or something. Pedro comes along, runs a stored procedure with a parameter value of 10. And for Pedro's data, a scan is best. Now it takes a little longer than Joe's, but for him, a scan is the best plan possible that the optimizer has chosen. Pedro's happy, Joe's happy. Oh, wait. Joe has to come back and run his query again. He comes back from his coffee break, he sits down at his computer, he kicks in the procedure, and that's about as red as Joe Face is actually when he runs this. He has encountered a performance degradation. Does this problem seem familiar to you? It's been a problem for a long time. Let's see what it looks like after with this optimization. Remember, no code changes, just a DB compat change in SQL Server 2022. Joe runs his procedure, everything's great. Plan gets evicted from cache, so just like before, Joe doesn't know that. Pedro comes along, gets his scan. When Joe comes back and runs again, the optimizer is smart enough to look at statistics, what's going on in the system, and say, I think Joe needs his own plan. We are now going to fork this and allow Joe to have a seek plan, Pedro to have a scan plan with the same stored procedure, with the same parameterized statement. And that in a nutshell is what we have provided for parameter sensitive plan optimization. Now, Bob, I'm tired of slides. You've been talking a lot. Can you show me a demo? This is a demonstration of what you saw in the keynote. Does this look familiar to you, right? This is live, my SQL Server. Oh, and by the way, I can prove it. There you go, folks. There is SQL Server's new version number right there. This is the internal private preview. It may not be that number in the end, but it's 16, right? So for the private preview, I'm running the real bits here live for you. Now I have this database for real estate agent listings that we created. By the way, huge call out for this demo. Who do I call out? Call out Jack Lee, Joe Sack, Pedro Lopes, a million other people. I just build these things. They build the scenario. They build all the details that go together. So here's the database. I got a table for agent property listings. I literally have a simple table that have listings and agent IDs in them. So here's that scenario. Remember, Joe was the index seek person. So he runs that procedure for 8, and you notice here, index seek, right? That's what's being used here. He's happy, runs very quickly. Now over here, to simulate what I showed you in the diagram, and you know, I did this in the keynote, and things are flying, you're like, Bob, what is he doing? Well, I'm just clearing the procedure cache to simulate plan cache eviction, and then I'm letting Pedro run his query, and it's a scan. So this is not possible today. Both can exist at the same time. So what I'd like to do is go through the demonstration and show you live what this actually did and why I chose what I did. What I chose was perfmon to look at a workload. I'm looking at CPU time, and I'm looking at batch request per second. And why do I do that? If you've seen DB demonstrations before, it's a very visual way to see workload throughput. Processor time I picked because it's going to show me like how much CPU is getting churned from this workload, because you're going to see some differences in the way the workload runs. And batch requests per second is not an elegant, but it's a very simple way of saying how many queries can I run as fast as possible, right? And so this is my little workload test. You've seen me do various examples in the past. So here are 2 PowerShell windows where I've been running these tests. Now let's go look at what I did. So up here at the top is my index seek example. Now, if you've not seen OStress before, I use this all the time. It's free, you can download it. And the story behind this is my just amazing colleagues, Keith Elmore and Robert Dorr, wrote this so long ago because they were tired of creating all these connived bug repros for the engineering team. And so they built a tool that just runs a bunch of queries as fast as possible. And he can do replays. So I still use that today. It's amazing, right? So here you go. Here's the stored procedure. Here's the parameter. This is like the number of concurrent users and the number of iterations. So I'm going to do that in the top window. That's what you're going to see over here in this window. Now down here, let me kind of expand this out. This is me doing the same thing as I did in that other window. I'm going to clear the procedure cache to simulate plan cache eviction. And then I'm going to run the scan, the Pedro query, just one time, because I just want to get that scan in cache. Let's kick it off and see what happens. So I'm going to remove these. And here I'm going to observe some behavior. So let me go here. This is the index seek. This is that shell script. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to go look at perfmon for a second. Now, what am I observing? It's a pretty healthy, workload from my testing. CPU's high, but it's not 100%. So it's kind of a healthy use of a CPU-bound query and a pretty good batch request per second. That's great. Let's run the scan. Now, I don't really care about perfmon in this case. I don't really care about its performance. I've already seen how fast that can run. What I want to know is if I run the other workload again, the first workload, the Joe query, what happens? So let me kick it again. So this is me simulating what I did on the slide. Now, do you see the problem here? Okay, this was us before. And let's use Zoom it to show the difference. So we went from here to here. I would say that is a degradation in performance, wouldn't you? And then look at this CPU utilization. Why is it so high? Because Joe's workload group is running a bunch of scans. A ton of scans are happening, all in memory, completely CPU bound, completely inefficient. This is, just imagine Joe Sack, you guys know Joe. Imagine him turning red, he's angry. I've never even seen Joe angry, but I bet he's angry now. This is so bad that I have to go back over here. I got to cancel this thing because I don't know when it's going to take. Now, if you look up here before this, let's just kind of scroll up. What did it look like before? Okay, so see this? It took like 3 seconds or so. You're going to see a little variation when I'm running this, but it's pretty fast to run all those users simulating this workload. So it's got a problem here, and I don't know how to fix it. Now, what do you do today to fix these kind of problems? You tune things, you use optimize for, you do all sorts of things. You're chasing your tail constantly to solve this problem. So let's go back over here in Management Studio, and let's set the DB compat level to 160. I'm going to go clear cache and query stores because I want to show you what the query store looks like. Let me make this clear. You do not need the query store for this functionality. I'm going to use the query store to show you the performance differences and the plans that are different after the fact. So I'm going to go run the DB compat here, change it to 160. Look, Ma, no hands, no code changes, right? Go back and run the same scenario. So let's go back here. Let's run our seek. Okay, let's run our seek. That's the performance I was counting on, right? That's kind of what I saw before, right? Looks good to me, no problem. This is the same scenario, all the changes with DB compat. Run the scan, go back here, and when that scan's finished, see that 3.8 seconds there or so? I expect it to be pretty darn close to that because I just told you I was going to solve the world. Do I even dare try this live? Please work, please work, please work. It's working! Look at that, look at that. On par with performance, on par with CPU, exactly what I was hoping for. I don't see any degradation in performance. Do I come back? Yeah, about the same time. That is pretty cool technology. Now, to prove this, I showed you in the keynote demo, the query store. Let's go here and look at it, spend a little time closer looking at it. So you might have looked at this in the keynote demo and go like, well, Bob, you're lying. Those are two different queries because they're different query IDs. I'll prove it's not in a second. This is the first one using the seek. And you see, here's the plan for it. I click here, I get a different plan for the scan. So what does it look like here? Go look at this. If you hover over here, you'll notice, and I'm going to use Zoom it now, folks, get ready. It's the same query, but here's what we have. We have this concept called variants, query variants, that help us achieve this technology, but it is the same parameterized statement. Again, I'll zoom here, and you can see, actually, let me scroll over this. Yeah, let me zoom here, scroll over. Again, a different query variant, same query. You're like, Bob, I still don't believe you, so I'll go to the DMVs, sorry, the catalog views. So I go to query store text, and there are two of them, and you're like, I told you, it's two of them, but here's where those variants are in here. I scroll over here. In fact, I expand this out. There's these variants. But here's where I can prove it. I'm going to query store query. It is the same query hash. So it's the same hash parameterized statement, but with these variants, it shows up in query store as two different texts. And that's why in the plans, it shows up as two different hashed plans. Now proving the same hash statement, two different query plans. I cannot begin to tell you how exciting it was to be able to finally unveil this for you. Now, guys, you need to know something about this technology. We're not going to go blow the cache, with tons of plans, right? We're going to get smart about this. Pedro's going to go a lot more depth for you today about this kind of type technology, and we're going to get your feedback about it, right? And we're going to maybe not do every type of query pattern that's possible, but I think it's going to solve a lot of the common problems people see from this technology. Okay, let's go back to our presentation. I think we're doing pretty good on time. I think we still have a lot of time left to cover the rest of the wheel. I spent a lot more time there because this is, quite frankly, some of the most groundbreaking technologies. If you look at those two first areas, we've invested a lot there. Cloud connectivity, built-in query intelligence. But Bob, what about the meat and potatoes? Are you still doing some stuff? We are. And this simply represents possibilities, not possibilities. These represents just a taste of what we're doing. I have another slide in a second to even give you some more. Cutter Cunningham sometimes call things a pile of things. Now this is an organized pile of things, but it is interesting because each of these represent areas and challenges customers have with our technologies today in security. Like we're enhancing always encrypted, make it even better. We keep doing that every release. We're doing some enhancements to Linux for SQL Server Linux as well. And then SQL Server Ledger, which I'll talk about in a second, is a technology that's in Azure today that we're bringing down to SQL Server. That's going to step up the game from a security perspective to solve some new problems for you. In the areas of scalability, things like making buffer pool more scalable. How about system page latch concurrency enhancements? Get ready for David Pless to show you Friday how we're going to still keep making that temp DB latch problem even better and better. And that's part of the work we're doing. And then we have some improvements in the space for Hackathon for in-memory OTP. For availability, you may have seen multi-write replication, but we have some new scenarios to show you there, some new automation there, and I'll show you in a second what that looks like. And then if you think about snapshot backups, today, one of the challenges customers have is that, let's take Linux, they have to write a VDI provider to do it. They don't want to use the volume snapshot provider because it doesn't exist on Linux. So what we're doing now is we're enabling lining up cross-platform snapshot backups by using T-SQL to help you freeze or quiesce your IO and then let you go handle the snapshot part. So I'm excited to see that technology. A lot of our partners have seen that, are pretty excited about that technology. Now, another thing David's going to dive into is backup compression. Intel is one of our favorite partners to work with. Great partner. I've seen those guys before on internal threads. We talk about performance and new technologies. They have this interesting technology called Quick Assist. Quick Assist is an Intel technology that allows for better compression. We are going to integrate that with our backup technology to offer you a new compression algorithm. It's going to make compression better, faster, and most importantly, free up CPU resources on the machine where you're doing the backup for your workload itself. Intel is spending time giving more details to us, yourself, our customers about what this looks like with SQL Server. And again, look for David to talk about more about that on Friday. So this is just a taste of what we're doing. There's more. As you see here, some enhancements for what we're doing for crypto algorithms. I mentioned before about Purview with performance monitor roles. How about some new granular roles and permissions? Sometimes those can be linked together. We're going to start supporting the latest versions of TLS and improve secure encrypted connections. And then other things that David will dive into: improve accelerated database recovery, XML compression for the first time. That's an interesting one. Improve things like shrink concurrency. How about parallel redo now for all databases? Improvement throughputs and connectivity for distributed availability groups, and even continuing the tradition of resumable operations with add constraint. Every one of these from the previous slide and this one is based on your feedback and experiences we've seen through our support organizations in our field. We don't just sit around and make this stuff up. We actually listen to what you have to say, and all of this represents the culmination of that work. And again, that third part of our circle, David will drive more of that on Friday. Okay, but let's talk about two of them, SQL Server Ledger and multi-write replication that I mentioned on these slides. What is the challenge? The challenge is that you want the power of blockchain in a centralized system like SQL Server. You don't want to have to use a decentralized system for blockchain technologies. Now, what does that even mean? It's tamper evidence track record of what's going over time. And in fact, it's going to use an encrypted ledger concept to protect this data and get that evidence. And we're going to build it into SQL Server with T-SQL. It really is a digital trust system. It's using a centralized system with encryption. And one of the cool things about it is it can help attestation for what's going on from third parties to make sure that things haven't been tampered with. Here's kind of how it works at a high level. Again, you can try this yourself in Azure today, and David will talk more about this as well on Friday. Consider the fact that in SQL Server, you may have a table that you identified to us through T-SQL as a ledger table. Now we're going to use technology that seems and looks a little bit like temporal to do history changes there and let you get a view on top of your ledger table. Now, what's different than temporal behind the scenes is we are using encryption to create a chain of encrypted blocks within the SQL Server database about the changes that have been made, hence the word blockchain. But it doesn't stop there. Somebody could potentially even try to go hack into this thing somehow at some point, right? And even fiddle with the blocks. So what are you doing? Well, we're going to take versions of these blocks called digests and put them in separate trusted storage for you. So now somebody like a regulator could come along and can verify that what's in trusted storage matches with the blocks inside the ledger, hence the idea of tamper evidence. Really excited to see this technology land. You're going to see a lot of demonstrations in the coming weeks and months about this, and excited for you, if you're in the private preview, to get your hands and try it. But again, you can actually test this with Azure if you want to today. Okay, so that is Ledger. What about multi-write replication? Bob, you mentioned that earlier, and I think a lot of people today are interested. How can I do a scenario where I have a sharded database, the same database, it's sharded across two replicas, so it's really the same database, right? But I would like people to be able to make changes to either one of these and reconcile those changes. In fact, I would like to use multi-write replication, which doesn't exist today with peer-to-peer replication, but I want it to be automatic and logical to handle conflicts. What does that look like? So first of all, you have this distributed database for these geo-localized writes. Wouldn't it be nice if we could enhance conflict detection so that the last writer is the one that wins, and do it automatically, and use things like UTC time to make that possible? And so you may be interested in looking at this diagram to kind of feel what it might look like and how it works. So I got two replicas, I got two users, and let's say that these two users in different time frames try to update the same row with different values. Now today, this would halt the peer-to-peer replication process. There is a conflict, but it would halt things. Now you go try to reconcile this manually, and your only choice is to reconcile it with like the highest replica ID, the highest ID. That doesn't seem very logical to a lot of people. So would it be nice if SQL Server 2022 in this same setup could do it both automatically and use something more logical, like the last writer that wins? So the stall is gone, you never even see that. There's still a conflict that occurs, but it automatically is handled with the person who's making the last change, regardless of where they were making the change. It's multi-write replication. And in all transparency, we did announce that this technology is in the latest cumulative update of SQL Server 2019. So it is the same technology there, but in SQL Server 2022, we're looking to also make sure that we enhance and make this more performant once that release is available. Okay, so we start at the top with cloud connected. Then we went to built-in query intelligence. I'm doing this visualization of it. Oh, I should do it backwards. I should do it this way. So we started with cloud connected. We did built-in query intelligence. We did the meat and potatoes. What else is there, Bob? Is there anything else that you haven't even talked about? There is. So Polybase, what the intention of Polybase was this: I need to access and use other storage systems, but I don't want to move the data. I'd like to just access where they are. And we started that tradition back in SQL 16 with accessing Hadoop system, unstructured data using Polybase. That system behind the scenes used like a Java technology to make that happen. It was a great start, but a lot of people didn't want to go down that path. So in SQL 19, we accelerated this by allowing ODBC drivers. You saw that, right? Like SQL Server, and MongoDB, and Oracle, et cetera. Now, those technologies for SQL 19 use something called a location to decide, is it a SQL Server, is it a MongoDB? And then, of course, where is the actual SQL Server or MongoDB or Oracle site? Like, where's the location of that? But you gave it kind of a type in there in the location string. Now, what we'd like to do in SQL 2022 is use REST APIs now to give you the same functionality, okay? And you're gonna see that we're gonna still give you external table concepts and open row set concepts to T-SQL to access these connectors, including things like S3 systems. And what I love about this is you're gonna have built-in support now for things like Parquet, even JSON. We had CSV before, but even Delta formats. So I'm really excited to see this technology come around. It's furthering the whole motion that I would like to use the power of T-SQL to access data in other systems that don't look like SQL Server, but make it feel like a SQL Server to me, using now REST API technologies. As we were building this technology, it occurred to us that a lot of people today are using object storage systems. So what we thought we would do is further what you do today with disk and URL-based backups and provide a REST API, including S3 compatibility, to go to object storage systems. So now you can take a SQL Server backup and you can back it up to one of these popular partners for object storage, and then you can restore it back to SQL Server. That's pretty interesting. In fact, I think we should go see what it looks like. Now I got to give credit here. We have some amazing people on our teams, James Rowland Jones, Melanie Quinn, love these people. I'm going to use their demos. I told you, I show this stuff off, but the people that are the true superstars are not here to show it to you. But guess what? You're going to see people like Melanie actually demonstrate this in other events we have coming up. So let me go bring up Azure Data Studio. And Melanie and JRJ worked together to build these notebooks. Remember the T-SQL notebook concept? So they built a notebook that allows us to go after external data from a min.io system. That's an example of what they chose here. And this is very similar to what I showed you guys in SQL 19 with Polybase. I create so let's go back to the top up here. I go here, this is proving we're on SQL Server 2022. I'm enabling Polybase, okay? Then you're gonna go in and set up your database to get ready for this. If they're using a call center type example. And what we had to do in Polybase before is create a master key and then a database scoped credential to access the remote system. And we're doing both of those things. We have a master key, which protects the credential. The credential is what we need to get access to our remote system. So I've got that set up. It's an S3 based system for min.io. And then now I'm going to come along and create what's called an external data source. Now, this is the important part. Notice here, remember location before in SQL Server 19, location was like, is it SQL Server? Where's the location? Now you see I've got a new thing called S3 listed here. And then this is the location of the S3 object storage. Now, a couple things that are interesting about object storage, like what the heck is that? If you've not spent time looking at it, you should take a look at it, because today people use file systems, even some block systems as well. Object storage is a new scalable, efficient way to store objects that are kind of like, kind of opaque objects, but it can be a very, very lucrative way to store your data. And a lot of people are choosing that as a central way to store a bunch of data, including unstructured data. So it could be you have unstructured Parquet files, for example, on the system. You just want to access them like you used to do with our old Polybase Hadoop technologies. So now that I've got this data source going here, I'm going to create an external file format. And notice here the format for Parquet. If you've not spent time looking at Parquet, think of column store in files. It's a columnar form, so it's very efficient to access data here. So it is unstructured, but in a way it's really structured. And we can take a look at the Parquet file to get information about the format of what's in it. That's pretty cool. So we're going to create the file format based on a Parquet format, which we know what a Parquet format is. It's a known protocol for formats. We're going to create a schema to get access to it. And then we're going to create an external table. Do you remember that concept of external tables? This is me going through here, or Melanie is the one that did this for me, going through here and creating a series of columns in an external table. Now, we're not storing the data in SQL Server. We're storing the data's in min.io. I'm just creating a schema definition in SQL Server of what all the columns look like in those Parquet files. And then notice here, this is the location within min.io of where the data is with some other information. And then notice here, we use the data source. Sorry, let me get this better here. This is the location within min.io with some additional information about the min.io system. Where is the actual file? And this is information here about the data source. That's how we're tying together. Like when we create this external table, SQL Server, you're going to query it. It's going to know to go to the min.io system in this directory with these parameters to get the unstructured data. And then it knows it's Parquet. So it knows how to read a Parquet file, filter on it if necessary, and bring back the results to SQL Server. Remember, you're not storing data, you're just going after the and bring the results back. So here is where we can do information in our schema to see the definition of all of this. This is system tables in SQL Server. And then here's what a select looks like. Just do a select statement. Guess what? Remember how this works? You could join this now with SQL Server data in your system or with other Polybase external data sources. And then finally, I told you that you can also use open row set. Now, look at this. I love Melanie's comment here. The data inside this Parquet file is compressed, and we didn't need to specify that in open row set addition. So open row set is smart because of Parquet in this case. So I'm not even creating an external table. I'm doing an ad hoc query against data in the MinIO system. And I'm telling it's Parquet, but I'm also telling it that data source of where MinIO is. Really cool technology, allowing you again to get data in things like S3 compatible systems with your SQL Server. What about backup restore? It's a similar concept. So I also have the ability to go in here to create a credential for the S3 system, doing a similar thing I did before for the Polybase, but I'm not doing it to go query the data in this case. I'm doing it to do backup restore. So here's an example of a table created in the system in SQL Server. And then I'm going to do a backup. So let's get to this right here. Remember we had a URL before? Well, now URL supports S3. And so this could be any one of S3 compatible type systems. And I'm literally doing a native SQL Server backup into an object storage system. And then I can turn around and I can restore it from that same system. Really great technology. A lot of customers centralizing in object storage. This could even potentially be like your DR site to store backups from SQL Server orthogonal to the SQL Server system. Okay, so I have now covered 5 pieces of our puzzle. I've covered cloud connectivity, built-in query intelligence, meat and potatoes, data virtualization, object storage, and the final discussion deals around T-SQL. So we know you like T-SQL. We have customers give us feedback all the time about the language, as you can imagine, through our various feedback mechanisms. And so what we're going to do in this release is 3 main areas. We're going to improve the JSON functions that we have. We've already released that in SQL 16. We're going to make those better and add new ones. So you can, as a developer, process JSON data in SQL Server in a better way. We're also going to extend the T-SQL surface area for common functions that you know and love, like string manipulation, and make those better based on your feedback, and also shore it up with ANSI compatibility standards in these areas. And then finally, in time series data today is very popular on the IoT edge. So in Azure SQL Edge, we actually have T-SQL functions to help you process time series data in buckets and intervals in a very efficient way. Well, customers said, I want that. I want that in the SQL Server engine. So in SQL Server 2022, we will now provide time series functions just like we have in Azure SQL Edge. Pretty amazing lineup of what we have. I know that you are wondering, like, what did you just say? That was a lot of information. Let's summarize what we talked about. SQL Server is Azure enabled more than ever before. Disaster recovery, analytics, and security. You saw the things we talked about. And tomorrow we'll dive deeper, more deeper of how those work and what kind of things you can see possible in your system with some demos in that space. Built-in query intelligence, query store on by default, query store for read replicas, query store hints, query store combined with intelligent query processing, parameter sensitive plan optimization with DB Compat 160, built-in query intelligence, no code changes. Pedro dives deeper after my session today. SQL Server 2022 continues the innovation for the meat and potatoes, security, scalability, and availability. A bunch of stuff we talked about, Ledger, multi-write replication. Dave Pless will dive into that Friday with more details for you. Data virtualization object storage. I show you demonstrations of how to use Polybase to access S3 compatible systems, both for Parquet files and also to store your SQL Server backups in those systems. And finally, we just talked about improvements to the T-SQL language we're doing. So now you are sitting back going, this is interesting. Pretty good overview, Bob. I kind of get where you guys are coming from. I want to go try it. I want to see more. So this top link right here, I'm going to pause to make sure you see this. This top link right here is our webpage. Go to the main website. It's a one-stop shop to see information about SQL Server 2022, links to videos, links to other events we're speaking on SQL Server. You go there to kind of learn more, and we'll keep refreshing and updating as we go along. We talked about the early adopter program. This is the link again to sign up for that program. It is a private preview today for SQL Server. So this is you working with us directly, private Teams channel, GitHub repos to see exactly how to use. But really, to be clear on this, it is limited. So our intention, again, is to work with customers that want to really look at this directly with us and spend time with us to innovate on this, give us feedback, see how it's going to meet the needs for their challenges. Now, there's this really cool team at Microsoft called Mechanics, and this came out last week. I just have so much fun working with those guys. They're like geniuses on animations and so forth. So go check out the video we built that talks about some of the things we shared today and gives you a lot more visualization of what these technologies look like. Now, next week, myself, Matthew Burrows, and Anna Hoffman will be on a SQL Server 2022 webinar. These webinars are very popular, and all the rock stars from the engineering team are going to be online doing live question and answers with you so you're going to see this today, you're going to watch other sessions today, and you're going to like, I need more information than what Bob showed, what David, what Pedro showed. Well, come to the webinar. We're going to talk about some of the same stuff you saw a little bit today, so it may feel like a rehash, but repeating this stuff is good because it's a lot to cover. But it is an opportunity as well to interact with his Q&A. I imagine between today and next week, you're going to get some additional questions. So it's a great time to come do there. And don't miss us on Data Exposed. I did a Data Exposed show already for some of the functionality with Anna Hoffman. There are more coming. In fact, next week, there's going to be a live Data Exposed show. I mean live. We are going to be live at the SQL Server Live Conference in Orlando, Florida. And Anna Hoffman and myself will be live. We may be bringing on some special guests to demonstrate some more of the functionality you saw today. In addition, there's a conference called the SQL Server and Azure SQL Conference, December in Vegas. Myself and others will be there as well to talk more about SQL Server 2022. If you're ready to come back to an event like that, we're ready for you. There's all sorts of great health protocols they've set up, so we'll be in person for that event. And again, as we move on to the next calendar year, get ready to see me more and more and other members of our team talk more and more about SQL Server 2022. This has been a lot of fun today to be online with you to do this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and do something that is pretty weird. I'd like to invite now on the camera, David Pless, Joe Sack, and Pedro Lopes. Guys, how's it going?
Good, how are you doing?
Hey, Bob, how are you doing?
Okay, please tell me there's been both a lot of questions, and I haven't seen any of the questions, and just crazy SQL servers, cool again. I mean, right? Has it been that way?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have about 32 questions that went through the filter. Some of it's feedback, some of it's questions.
Okay.
Some of that feedback, by the way, I see is good for VNext, so let's remember to capture that. But yeah, a lot of good questions, a lot of different buckets. Bob, one theme I see a lot of questions about PSP in particular.
Well, I bet there would be, because people are like, so you're probably sitting back in the audience going like, yes, or you're like, I got to know more.
Yes.
Or maybe both, right? So Pedro, maybe you'll talk about that more today?
I will, and I actually just adjusted the session to add a couple of topics that were on the chat today.
Wait a minute, are you telling me that you went to this session and you as a speaker took feedback to change the session that's next or something, right?
That's what happened, yes.
Man,
exactly.
Don't you love how this just all works out? So guys, I'm gonna put you guys on the spot a second, okay? So Joe, I'm gonna hit you up first, okay? So a lot of you guys know Joe Sack, but he's not speaking at these events, right? He's not doing this. Do you know why? Like, Joe owns everything. He's like the Lord over SQL. Joe is actually runs a team called SQL Everywhere. Hey, Joe, first of all, tell us about SQL Everywhere, a little bit about what that means.
Yeah.
We're going to do an AMA panel with you and the rest of the Everywhere team Friday. So tell us about Everywhere first, and then just give us your like, what would you want the audience to walk away today about SQL Server 2022?
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, you had mentioned earlier you've never seen me angry. I'm still not angry, so we're good. We're good. So
Come on, Joe. We need to see the
yes,
angry Joe
yes.
face.
Someday.
David Pless is going to create a meme on the angry Joe face at some point.
It'll happen. It's bound to. So by the way, SQL Everywhere team is actually our internal team name. We actually have a few folks. I think there are 17 PMs on the team altogether, and two big areas we own are SQL Server Engine, and then also we own Azure Arc enabled data services. Oh. So you think about the Everywhere part being wherever you are, if you're on a competitor cloud, if you're in Azure, if you're on-prem VMs, we touch all of that. It's very helpful because of this unified team, because we make sure that we coordinate, we place, we have consistency, we share feedback. There's a lot of efficiencies around having this centralized. In terms of takeaways, one kind of semi-joke, but not really, is don't underestimate the power of engineers having to manage millions of databases in the cloud. So with Azure SQL, We, of course, have customer feedback. We, of course, get a lot of input. We see customer volume cases, but we also have to manage many, many databases in the cloud. And so we can see thematically where the pain points are, and we can start addressing issues in that space. So even if you are not going to the cloud, a lot of that innovation that we're using to solve issues have now landed in SQL Server 2022. So if there's one takeaway, it's just that this is a full ecosystem. We're not forcing you in any area. I think the cliche we're using is we'll meet you anywhere, but it's true. We will bring the engine wherever you are. And I think that's the big one. I know that there's some comments of, is this all Azure features? But you could see from today, it's everything, especially for our past audience, so much in the engine, and even probably a few surprises that are coming as we go along through preview phases.
So Joe, on that theme, Pedro, let me turn to you for a second. Today, you're speaking about intelligent database. Why don't you share a little bit your perspective on what that kind of means? And then give us a little teaser, like why should anybody come this afternoon to your session?
Two loaded questions, Bob.
Yes, I always do that to you, Pedro, on the spot.
Intelligent database is the term we use for a roadmap that we have internally, and for which you have seen several waves already released into the product, both in SQL Server and in Azure SQL Database, which usually is weeks to months ahead of SQL Server. So the intent here is that we want customers to be able to upgrade, to keep modernizing, but not have to make code changes, not incur into risks that were in the past very, very high of regressions and thorough testing of applications, because from version to version, too much change without control. So intelligent database is all about being able to automatically scale workloads, keep performance, keep predictability as data changes and data distribution changes. And you shouldn't have to do any code changes to leverage all that.
All right, Pedro. So today, I think hopefully you can take what I kind of started with this concept and then maybe give us a little more deep. People have some questions about, are there limitations for some of this? And tell me more about this max DOP thing, CE feedback. I mean, are you going to go into kind of a little more depth in that today?
I will, in as much as I can go in 1 hour.
Sure.
Alas, I only have 1 hour. We were joking earlier today that, well, it's
Pedro, you only have 1 hour.
Yes, but with all that we have, if I were going to show demos on everything, plus go to all the detail, I would love to be able to share with everyone. We'd take half a day at least.
Okay.
So
two things about Pedro. So things about Pedro. Number one, what you don't know is his other amazing job amongst a bunch of jobs. He's kind of like the herding cat person at SQL Server 2022. Like Pedro runs the release for us, right? So behind the scenes, Pedro is both a friend and enemy to people in the engineering team. I'm just kidding, Pedro. I'm just kidding. No, actually, I can't think of anybody better that Joe's picked to help us lead the charge to make this release possible. And I'm so excited to see how this is going to land for general availability. Another cool thing is at the SQL Server and Azure SQL conference in Vegas in December, Pedro, I think you're coming with me, and then you're going to do a bunch of deep dives there, right?
I have 3 hours to talk about this.
Oh, wow.
Oh, man. Page over 3 hours, right? All right, David, let's finish and talk to you a little bit. Dave, you've been around a long time. You've seen a lot of things happen in our engine space. So tell us a little your Friday session. Give us a little teaser on what you might show there on your storage engine capability session.
Yeah, so one area I definitely want to get into is the system page latch concurrency enhancements, and we're gonna try to illustrate that. TempDB is constantly improved. SQL 2016, 2017, 2019. I'm going to even compare 2019 to SQL Server 2022 and show that how even on 2022 we can address some areas of contention that we had left remaining in 2019. So I think that'll be a really interesting thing for folks to see. Also want to talk about some of these areas like XML compression, buffer pool parallel scan capabilities, all types of scenarios that just gives you a lot more scalability. And that's going to be the real message is performance and scalability in the engine.
Yeah, David, I think some people saw my little pile of stuff list. They're like, hey, wait a minute. I want to, Bob, stop. So I think they want to know more of that stuff. And so I think I've seen your presentation, your session that you're going to do. I've seen some of the slides. I love those details because core engine people got to know what that stuff is and how does it help them. So really excited to see you on there Friday. So other thing, folks, I'm going to tell you if you haven't seen, on Friday, we have an Ask Me Anything panel hosted by me. One of the cool things about hosting a panel is that you don't have to answer the questions. You get to ask the questions. So, Joe, I think we have like 15 people on or something. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a party. So
it's a party. It's a party. So come to that Friday. Come to that Friday. Ask any of your questions you want about the SQL Everywhere team. Excited to see that. Hey, folks, thank you for joining today in this past session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. We are just starting the journey for SQL Server 2022. It's just beginning. I can't wait to work with the folks you see here on camera, all the folks behind the scene, all the great people that you haven't seen today. They work so hard to make this happen. And I look forward in calendar year 2022 to march towards public preview and general availability. Thanks again for attending today's session on SQL Server 2022.